Today we're at the ice cream shop and we're going to be taking pictures of this ice cream sundae. We'll learn how to use Aperture to help bring emphasis to the subject when the background may distract. We'll also learn how to tie the background in with the subject when all of the details are of interest. The aperture is the opening in your lens. It controls the amount of light that passes through the lens to the image sensor. The size of the aperture can be changed from very small to very large. The size of the opening is expressed on your camera as a number, or f-stop. In other words, the aperture is the opening in the lens and the f-stop is the setting on the camera that controls the size of that opening. The smaller f numbers, like f2.8, give the largest opening. The higher f-stop numbers, like f22, will give you a smaller opening. For example, f2.8 will give you a very large aperture, which in turn allows more light into the camera. Likewise, f22 is a small aperture, which will allow less light into the camera. The camera requires light to pass through the lens to the image sensor to record a photo. It's important that just the right amount of light gets to the image sensor. Too much light or too little light will cause your image to be too bright or too dark and will reduce the quality of your image. Your camera's light meter will help you to know which f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO to use to make sure that you have the correct amount of light entering the camera for every shot. An underexposed image is too dark and you'll lose detail in the shadow areas. When the little arrow on your camera's light meter is to the right of the center point, it's indicating that the image will be underexposed. To fix this, you can adjust the f-stop to a smaller number to increase the amount of light that is allowed into the camera. This will brighten up the image and allow the detail in your shadows to appear. An overexposed image will be too bright and you'll lose detail in the highlights. When the little arrow on your camera's light meter is to the left of the center point, it is indicating that the image will be overexposed. To fix this, you can adjust the f-stop to the larger number to decrease the amount of light that is allowed into the camera. This will darken the image and allow the detail in your highlights to appear. It's important to check the light meter on every shot. By doing this before you take the photograph, you can save yourself of having to reshoot the photo because of poor exposure. The aperture, or f-stop, also controls what is known as depth of field. Depth of field is the range of your image that is in focus. The smaller the f-stop, the more shallow your range of focus, or depth of field, will become. The point that you focus on will always stay in focus, but the area in front of that point and the area behind that point may be blurry or sharp, depending on your f-stop. The higher the f-stop, the more area that stays in focus. The depth of field always begins from the focal point and grows from that point depending on your aperture. These changes are created simply by changing the f-stop. A high f-stop number like f16 or f22 will give you a large depth of field and keep more things in focus. A low f-stop like f2.8 or f4 will give you a shallow depth of field, keeping the subject in focus but making the space in front of the subject and behind the subject blurry. Depth of field is also controlled by the size of the scene. The depth of field on a close-up shot of our ice cream will be much shallower than the depth of field on a landscape, even if they're both taken with the same f-stop, because the landscape is a much larger scene. The depth of field is also in proportion to how close the camera is to the subject. If you use a very low f-stop number and you're very close to a subject, you may find that part of the subject is not in focus. For this reason, when photographing close-ups, you may want to use the very lowest f-stop. Digital cameras have two different modes that will allow you to change the f-stop. One is manual mode and the other is aperture priority mode. In manual mode, you'll be responsible for making sure that both the aperture and the shutter speed are balanced to make a properly exposed image. In aperture priority mode, you will only need to choose the aperture and the camera will choose the appropriate shutter speed for a properly exposed image. When we take pictures of this ice cream, we'll want to use a smaller f-stop to make sure that the background is blurry so that the emphasis is on the subject, the ice cream. If we use a larger f-stop, the background will be in focus and the ice cream will lose emphasis. So let's take a few pictures of this ice cream to see just how depth of field and f-stops are connected. First, we'll take some pictures with everything in sharp focus. To do that, we'll set the camera to aperture priority mode and choose an aperture of f22. Now let's take some pictures with only the ice cream in focus. We're still in aperture priority mode, and this time we'll choose an aperture of f3.5. When we see both images side by side, it shows what a difference the depth of field can make. The photo with the shallow depth of field, the blurry background, immediately draws attention to the ice cream, while the photo with everything in focus has distractions in the background and can take away from the subject. As you're looking through the viewfinder, you may not be able to see the full impact of depth of field. When you change f-stops, they may all look very similar. It's a good idea to review the photographs after they've been taken to see the differences. Photographs taken with a large depth of field may have distractions in the background that lead the viewer's attention away from your intended subject. A shallow depth of field can minimize those distractions by making them blurry. The viewer won't pay attention to the blurry parts of the image, keeping the emphasis on the main subject. A shallow depth of field is useful for images where the background may be distracting, or places where the subject may blend in with the background. Photographers often use a shallow depth of field when they're taking close-up shots and when they're photographing people. A large depth of field is great for images where everything fits together and will not distract the viewer from the intended subject. Landscapes are a great example of this. In a landscape photo, all of the details are of interest and should be in focus. As the photographer, your job is to help the viewer immediately know what part of your image to look at, what the main subject is. By utilizing the proper aperture, you can ensure that the image is properly exposed and that the viewer gets the correct message from your photo.